Good evening from the News Radio 1120 and 93.7 FM KPNW studios. I'm shortstop Chigger McGee. I'm Bill London. I do the wake-up call on KPNW 6 a.m. to 9, Monday through Friday, streaming worldwide at kpnw.com, and your crazy, wacky, insane Oregon news brought to you by none other than Sean Sutherland. Sean Sutherland, of course, his gig is insurance. And a lot of people have questions about their insurance, questions about what insurance they should get, questions about insurance that they already have, and they have a lot of questions. That's why you need to reach out to Sean Sutherland. He even recommends it because the name of his company is Ask Insurance. Sean is there to answer your questions, whether it be about your annuities, about your life insurance, about your medical insurance, Medicare, all the questions that you have, you need to ask Sean. Ask Insurance. He brings you the crazy, wacky Oregon news. All right, so we're going to start off with an interesting story, and it has to do with a fire that broke out here in Oregon back, actually it started happening Wednesday. Thursday is when it really blew up, and this was down near Roseburg. It was called the Mount Nebo fire. And this was one of those fires that was burning on the outskirts of Roseburg, which is in Douglas County. It was burning on a mountain that's just right there on the outskirts of Roseburg. And it went from 8 acres to 50 acres fairly quickly. It was driven by winds. And there is more to it than that. And we'll explain it to you right now. So the firefighters, when they first started jumping on this, it was during daylight hours. And you have the Douglas Forest Protective Association, the Roseburg Fire Department, some other agencies that all were jumping on this fire because it is very dry here. That area is fairly heavily forested, but it's also in fairly steep, rocky terrain. So what they did was they called in air tankers, helicopters and the like to try and drop water on this thing while it was in the opening stages. And then quickly they stopped and they couldn't do it. And the reason for that is because somebody was flying a drone right in the middle of the fire zone. Now, that grounded the aircraft at the very early stages during the daylight hours, just before it was getting dark, basically keeping the attack on the wind-driven fire only on the ground in an area that was hard to access. Now, that fire, as I said, continued to grow to 50 acres. Roseburg police then said, you know what, maybe we need to find out who was flying the drone. And they started to investigate. And they were able to cite 41-year-old Christopher Allen Page of Roseburg for interviewing or interfering with a firefighter. Now, here's how they tracked him down, and it was pretty straightforward. Somebody called them and said, hey, there's this guy that's posting drone footage on his Facebook page here of the fire. And isn't that illegal to do that? So police officers, with assistance from the Douglas Forest Protective Association, tracked the drone operator and operation to Page's address on the 1400 block of Main Street, and shall we say they knocked on his door. So Page reportedly admitted to flying the drone, but east of the South Umpqua River to film the fire. However, a posted video from the suspect allegedly showed his drone hovering right over the top of a helicopter right inside the fire zone. Now, as a result of him flying his drone there in airspace that should have been used by firefighters, they grounded all of those assets and resources and were unable to use them to try and extinguish the fire due to safety. So as a result, the DFPA was forced to suspend, like I said, all the aircraft water drops because of safety reasons, totally complicating and slowing down the firefighting efforts. Now, fines for flying a drone over a fire and hindering efforts can be as high as $25,000. Like I said, the fire was held finally to about 50 acres, and most of the mop-up work was completed late yesterday, actually Sunday. Now, when we were talking about this on my show, The Wake Up Call, this morning, and I'll be pretty honest, I'm fairly critical of anybody who does this. Not only because you're putting the pilots potentially in danger, but you're also slowing down and hindering firefighting efforts. Fortunately, this was an area where they were able to keep it from going down the mountain and actually into Roseburg. But different circumstances, particularly with the winds the way they were, this could have been completely different in different terrain. And you've got this guy that just decides, I'm going to put my remote control drone up in the air, or I'm going to take some cool pictures, and wow, look at all the hits I'm getting on Facebook and Instagram. And we had a number of listeners that were like, well, we smell something stinky here. You can't bring down an airplane or a helicopter with a simple drone. So I decided to do a little bit of research. And I didn't have to go back very far. A Southern California man operating a drone during the Palisades fire down in California accidentally flew his drone into a firefighting airplane over that fire and punched a 3 by 6 inch hole in the wing of what's called a super scooper from Canada and grounded the airplane, causing $65,000 worth of damage. And oh yeah, he got caught. And oh yeah, he got taken to court. And Peter Tripp Aikman, a 56-year-old, agreed to plead guilty to unsafe operation of an unmanned aircraft. And he was charged a total of $65,000 to repair the aircraft, along with 150 hours of community service. Now, fortunately, the judge went easy on him because he could have spent a year in prison for that as well. And all things considered, would I feel bad about that? All things considered, he could have actually caused that plane to crash. $65,000 isn't chump change. That's quite a little bit of damage. Fortunately, it was a very large aircraft. Now imagine something like that happening to, say, a helicopter and flying into potentially the blades or into the motor, or you get my point. So, yeah, I don't have any sympathy for these people. And honestly, I think that they should pay the full fine. But that's just me. So, in other news, we had the U.S. Track and Field Championships right here in lovely Eugene at Hayward Field. And they ended on Sunday, and on the last day of the U.S. Track and Field Championships at lovely and historic Hayward Field, some protesters dropped by for a fairly interesting protest. They held a funeral procession calling for an end to the killing in Gaza. The protesters, and there were quite a few of them, walked up and down Agate Street, going back and forth between the north and south entrances of Hayward Field for a little over an hour, carrying sheets that were made to look like corpses of dead children. And along with that, each person had paper with a name and the age of a Palestinian child killed clipped to their shirts. The group's demands are, like most, they want the U.S. to stop selling arms to Israel. They want the U.S. to denounce Israel. They want a Palestinian homeland, and they want justice and aid for Palestinians. Okay, so this is a story that goes to what I would call one of the things that's wrong with Oregon's justice system. And actually, this is part of a nationwide movement to do away with bails and seeing a judge prior to going to your first court hearing. So, The law in question was one that was passed back in 2021, and it was Senate Bill 48. And what it did was, well, first off, it said that no longer would it be up to a judge to decide after a person was arrested whether they should be held for arraignment, that it would be left up to what would be called a judicial officer. Now, this is just simply a law enforcement officer who works at the jail. And when this law was set up, Senate Bill 48, they said, well, the Chief Justice has to come up with a list of crimes that essentially they might be held for. To really get to the basis of this, simply, if you commit a crime that does not directly endanger somebody, you essentially are going to be sent to jail, booked, then you're going to be released, and you're going to be released without bail. That's the way that it works. And we've pointed out on this particular show a number of instances where this has really failed. Like, for instance, there was the individual that was essentially a regional leader for a drug cartel that had been busted for dealing a number of times in Portland, would just go into jail and would just be released. And essentially, it took the feds coming in and arresting this cartel leader to actually keep him in jail. And this is one of those stories. So we're looking at an individual in Portland, 35-year-old Aubrey Edwards. So he was arrested on Tuesday night of last week, and then a couple of hours, he was arrested again for suspicion of arson. And Portland police believe that he's connected to a slew of cases that started back on July 20th. And the latest incidents that happened, and the last time he was arrested, was while he was walking home from jail from previously being arrested on Tuesday night. So Wednesday morning after midnight, the guy's walking home and said, allegedly, "Ooh, I bet I could set a fire there." And all of this is shining a light on Senate Bill 48, which basically green lights somebody walking free instead of being held pre-trial before a judge comes in and arraigns you. Now, supporters of this measure, and there were many of them, said that it would reduce the duration of pre-trial jail stays so that it would cause less harm to the livelihoods and individuals and families of those accused. Because, well, these are all lower level crimes that don't threaten lives. Correct. Arson is one of those on the list that is not considered to be life-threatening, with one exception, and we'll get to that. The measure was also supported by Get Soft on Crime proponents who believe that the idea of paying bail is inequitable. Now, one of the supporters who argued that it was inequitable was none other than Get Soft on Crime former Multnomah County District Attorney Mike Schmidt. Remember Mike Schmidt of The Schmidt Show? He testified in 2021 in favor of the bill, calling bail an absolute injustice. His words. Now, according to the Portland Police Bureau, officers responded to 2 car fires on Tuesday. And nearby, who did they find? Well, they found Aubrey Edwards, so they took him into jail. In the early morning hours of July 30th, after being processed, well, they sent him on his way. And then they arrested him again a short time later. Because not only did he set 4 cars on fire, but he also set fire to a house that somebody was living in. Now, this time, because it actually would be considered a threat to life, he stayed in jail. At this point, it's believed that this guy has set over a dozen fires, and he's been arrested more than just the 2 times for these. But every time he's arrested, he's booked and he's released because, well, the arson fires, they're just not life-threatening. And if it destroys somebody's property, like their freaking car, oh, well, that's why you have insurance. Now, we do know that there is an initiative petition that right now is in the early stages of collecting signatures just to be able to go to the Secretary of State's office, get a title, and then allow the petitioners to go out and collect the 150 some odd thousand signatures to put it on a ballot that would completely undo Senate Bill 48. And this is really why we call it crazy Oregon news. So, Multnomah County's Preschool for All director, so that is a program that's in Multnomah County that taxes people so that their kids can go to preschool. This Preschool for All director has resigned after her ties to a preschool provider had been accused of potential fraudulent spending of state dollars, which kind of called her credibility into question with her employers, Multnomah County. Now, this is kind of getting into the weeds, but we had told you a couple of weeks ago that the Secretary of State's office did an audit of an Oregon program that is called the Preschool Promise. Now, that is a statewide program that the state has dumped millions of dollars into. And that audit, as we told you, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, found that a whole lot of preschools were doing a whole lot of kind of shady stuff. And that might be the case with our friend Leslie Barnes, who resigned. Now, she was the director of the preschool program for Multnomah County. She also owns a preschool herself that was receiving funds from the state for the Preschool Promise. Well, it turned out that one of the preschools that she owns actually was one of those that did some stuff that's just a little bit on the kind of iffy side. So it turns out between 2021 and 2024, Village Childcare, which Leslie Barnes owns, collected over $883,000 from the state. $883,000. Now, that was designated to pay for 63 seats in her preschool. The school only enrolled 9 kids throughout that period, but she got paid $833,000 for, well, essentially to have 63 students when they only had 9. Now, the Oregon Department of Justice is reviewing that audit report, and they are flagging, shall we say, misused funds. And the Department of Justice is not actually talking about any of the preschool providers that are being investigated, but it turned out that Village Childcare just happened to be one of those that was mentioned in the Secretary of State's little audit. So you have somebody that owns a preschool that was collecting all of these dollars from the state, $883,000, so that they could offer preschool for 63 kids, and they only did 9. And that same person happens to be the director of yet another large preschool program in Multnomah County. Nothing to see here, folks. Move along. Well, Portland's mayor says the state's largest city is going to adjust their programs and policies to preserve federal funding. Portland manages $349 million in active federal funds, with 90% of it going to housing and transportation. And that money, as we've reported here, was at risk because, Well, a lot of the stuff the city does fails to comply with the Trump administration's anti-DEI policies. So Mayor Keith Wilson says that he consulted with more than a dozen community leaders before deciding a way to bring the city in compliance. Now, according to city spokesperson Cody Bowman, the plan is to adjust the wording in the city's programs and policies so they can certify grant applications as needed to hold on to as much federal funding as they possibly can, because the Trump administration said, if we're going to offer you these grants, you need to qualify with some brand new rules. So in the letter to organizations that receive federal funding through the city, Wilson wrote that complying with federal anti-discrimination laws as they will be interpreted under President Donald Trump means that, quote, city programs and services cannot give preference to groups with protected class status based on characteristics such as race or gender. Wilson's letter indicated that any wording changes would make it clear that programs funded with federal dollars would be available to anyone, regardless of protected class status. And then he added, Portland believes in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and proudly uses those words, except when they're trying to get federal money. All right, there is your crazy Oregon news, a little wackier than usual. And now it's time for Rick to roll out the reel.